You've been hearing us talk about imperial yeast for a while now, and that's because we absolutely love this stuff. With 200 billion cells in each pitch-right pouch, we rarely even need to make starters these days. Unfortunately, not everybody has the access to imperial yeast those of us out here on the West Coast do, because they're based out of Portland, Oregon. But things are about to change. Imperial Yeast is excited to announce the opening of their East Coast location, which is huge for those who want the freshest yeast possible with the best pitch rates, but brew on the other side of the country. They're going to start by offering their four most popular strains, A38 Juice, A07 Flagship, L13 Global, and Go3 Dieter, with the goal of providing their full lineup of yeast by mid-2021. So start your planning now at imperialyeast.com. As I imagine is the case for many, there was a point soon after I started homebrewing where I told myself and my wife that making my own beer was a good thing, not only because it provided me with something fun to do, but that it was cheaper than buying beer at the store. On the surface, this was mostly true. I mean, I could knock out a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of pale ale for a few bucks more than what a couple 12-packs of craft beer cost. Of course, when you take gear and energy expenses into account, it's probably more of a break-even situation. But either way, I was intent on coming up with ways to reduce my per-batch price, and seeing as yeast is typically the most expensive ingredient used in brewing, that's where I focused most. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and in this experience episode, I'm joined by contributor Andy Carter to discuss our experiences with harvesting and reusing yeast.
What's interesting about reusing yeast is it's commonplace. It's part and parcel of running a professional brewery. It's actually the opposite for many home brewers. Oh, I'll just buy a pack of USO5 and I won't worry about it.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of really good techniques and in thought processes and why would you want to reuse yeast. I think you gave the cost one as one, but also there's kind of a house character that derives if you kind of use the same yeast carefully every time. So I think there's some cool opportunities for home brewers to play in that space.
Absolutely. And I'll admit, I'm a pretty cheap dude in general who enjoys finding ways to save some coin. And that sentiment absolutely motivated my interest in harvesting and reusing yeast over the years. I've tried a number of methods, as I know you have too, Andy, and I look forward to chatting with you about our experiences with that. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up, April of 2021 is everyone's favorite brewcaster, host of the Brewing Network podcasts, Dr. Homebrew and The Session, our friend Jason J.P. Petros. To know him is to love him. JP has been in the brewing scene for a very long time, starting with More Beer when it was in its infancy before jumping over to the Brewing Network. I've little doubt this is going to be one of the more entertaining sessions that we've had. If you'd like to be a part of it, be sure to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by Friday, April 23rd, 2021. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support. When shopping online, your experience doesn't change a bit, and we get a little kickback for the referral. All right, feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who offer brewers beautiful stainless gear, such as the turnkey BH15 Pilot Brewing System, which has a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Brewers Hardware has a ton of unique purpose-built products useful to both professionals and homebrewers. Go see for yourself at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. We got an absolute metric ton of feedback on our recent Brews Views episode where we discussed our opinions on traditional brewing methods. One came from listener Mark Nordstrom, who had this to say. As a die-hard brew-in-a-bag brewer, I've been distressed and dismayed recently while browsing several homebrewing forums. It seems that many uninformed brewers are squeezing the bag with red gloves. WTF. Everyone who is not a troglodyte knows that the mint green rubber gloves produce a vastly superior beer, especially lagers.
I'm still happy. It's 2021. I mean, people still have a sense of humor, and I'm glad to see this here. That episode is important because I think we do get wrapped up in history and consistency. And I mean, there is reasons that German lagers are made a certain way, right? And it produces an excellent product, but you can color outside the lines and still make a great batch of beer. So let's not be too serious about this all the time.
I know that he was joking. I know that Mike was joking, but I feel like he was hitting on something here that is actually important. The fact that some people really do seem to make a big deal out of things that just don't matter that much, or we like to invest energy in making things matter that maybe really don't. And, you know, I'm not here to say what does and what doesn't matter or what people should or should not focus on, but I do think it's a nice little dose of levity from you, Mike. So I appreciate the feedback. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. I'm the type of dude who really likes to drink a few beers when I'm hanging out with friends, so my preference for lower ABV styles tends to kind of make sense, I guess. Well, that said, I do enjoy the occasional big beer, and one of my favorites is Russian Imperial Stout, a style that lends itself really well to barrel aging. Well, listener Zach Otting sent me a bottle of Russian Imperial Stout he said was brewed as a part of a project with his club, the Cincinnati Malt Infusers, and he said it was aged for 6 months in a New Riff bourbon barrel.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Dark and ominous, just like your future.
Boom!
Feels like the first time. Ooh, it's a barley wine.
Ooh, God, Lord.
Lick my stockings. It's a barley wine,
That thing
dude.
is strong.
It's a barley wine. It's
yeah.
at least 10% by volume.
At least.
We are as learned as...
We just nailed it.
We are not ashamed of our learnedness.
Out of the barley wine, this is a tasty one.
Ooh, but the only comparison with barley wines is Devil's barley. Remember Devil's barley wine?
That was very good,
It
too.
was the best. So on a scale of is this Devil's or not, toast me and take a sip. That's delish, dude. It might be Devil's barley wine.
It's very good.
I'll put it at even with Devil's barley wine.
Yeah, I mean,
Devil, if you're listening to this doesn't reflect poorly on you. This is good.
I remember his being very good.
It was so good.
and
Remember?
this is good.
So a couple things we're going to stand on because we are learned and we are now super learned and uber learned and we are pantheons of learnedness. This is a barley wine. This is above 10% by volume, and this is delicious. What do you think? Are we going to stand on that?
I am. I'm good with that.
Do we stand united?
Bam. Right.
Bam. Let's not pound it, though.
It's a Russian Imperial Stout.
Okay, reverse tape. This is a
I was
Russian
gonna
Imperial
say,
Stout, and it is so goddamn good. But it kind of tastes like a barley wine, but we're not that idiot. We're not idiots. We're learned. It's totally
I almost
a Russian.
said Russian Imperial Stout.
You know, the other day I was in Russia, and I'm like, this Imperial Stout tastes like a barley wine. I get it, dude.
Yeah. It's
I mean,
they almost-
obviously.
you almost can't compare. I mean, it's good. It's very good.
Yeah, it's delicious, isn't it?
I'm going 9.
I'm rating it as a barley wine.
I already said 9. I'm good with that.
I go with 9. Double 9, which is 99 times 3 with the inflation.
And the square root.
63 Jersey Tims.
Dude, this beer was absolutely delicious. Rich coffee and chocolate flavors with a very nice wood character. The bourbon was there, but it didn't come off too strong. That's one of the things that I struggle with bourbon barrel aged beers.
Yeah.
Is when it tastes more bourbony than it does beery. This was perfectly balanced. I'm dead serious. One of the best Russian Imperial Stouts that I've had. Great job to the Cincinnati Malt Infusers Homebrew Club. I believe it was like a barrel project they were working on together.
Yeah.
I love this beer. I could see how the guys might compare it to a barley wine, but it was definitely a Russian Imperial Stout.
Yeah, it's funny they kept saying barley wine, but you know they're still learning. I mean, but though it's really nice. You're getting 2-minute beer reviews now. You're getting 100% more Jersey and Tim these days. You know, I've done the barrel aging projects too, and you know it's funny is we've done a lot of sour stuff, and I think this episode we'll talk a little bit about sour reuse, which I think is important, or sour and wild reuse. But you know, with barrel aging clean beers, it can be very tricky. Our club has done these very expansive bourbon barrel projects, and there's always a little bit of mixed results. So I'm glad to hear that their project worked out well for you.
I'm telling you, it worked out better than well. I was really pleased with the way this beer tasted and came across. Barrel aging is tricky for me, at least. I tend to be a little bit picky. I remember somebody brought a barrel aged, it was just an oak barrel. It wasn't bourbon barrel, but a barrel aged Saison to a club meeting here in town. And everyone was raving about it, and I just thought it was horrible. All I tasted was oak,
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things. I kind of give or take. And what I found is that I really do enjoy the barrel character when the beer is big, when it's higher ABV.
Sure.
And this Russian Imperial Stout, it worked. It was delicious. Thank you so much for sending that in, Zach. If you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage you feel like sending in reviewed by Jersey and Tim on the show, you can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. Time for a quick break. When we return, our focus will be on harvesting and reusing yeast. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort, from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature, in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. When I made the switch from extract brewing to all grain, it didn't take long for me to become absolutely obsessed. I think a lot of people can relate with me on that one. And it was to the point that I was brewing a minimum of 2 batches per month, usually 4 to 6. As awesome as it was to have such a vast variety of beer on tap and something to do in my garage, it came at a price, which is what ultimately led me to buying grains and hops in bulk. However, I was still buying yeast for each batch. I was running to the homebrew store or getting on morebeer.com and buying yeast, which amounted to around $50 a month. Well, with the goal of reducing my monthly brewing expenses, I began looking into ways to reuse yeast and discovered a few fairly popular methods. Before we dig into those methods specifically, it's probably a good idea for us to talk a little bit about yeast in general for a bit, as they are living organisms that are affected by their environment on some level.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think common for a lot of people, you're going to start with, especially in the beginning homebrewing, you're looking at dry yeast. It's a simple on-road to producing a good beer at first time, but also liquid yeast. And the difference there is that yeast can be kind of essentially go into hibernation. They just get dried out, and they're still can be reconstituted in water. And that's just that kind of wake-up process that we'll get into in a minute. But, the liquid yeast is, I think, even nowadays, maybe when Marshall and I started, dry yeast were really the main thing. But now liquid yeast, I mean, there's so many companies now. There's so many high quality yeast producers, and there's a variety. And so they're just live sitting in this bag. And then what's going to happen is you could do one of two things to start the beer up. You can make a starter, and that's basically a small volume of wort made ahead of time, but at a fixed, you want to be around 1040 starting gravity. That's where a lot of people like to start them. What's really handy if you're starting yeast is, you start with a 10-to-1 ratio of water to dry malt extract. So you want to make a 1 liter starter, 1,000 liters of water, 100 grams of DME, you're good to go.
Yep.
So you put that in there, and then the yeast are going to do a couple things. So now that they know there's food around, they're going to wake up a bit, and they're going to consume oxygen, and this is helping them produce their cell walls and just their whole metabolic reaction. And then they're going to start consuming, and they're going to start growing, and there's going to be a growth phase to the yeast because they're just going to start wanting to multiply, and they multiply through asexual reproduction. They bud off new yeast cells, right? So you're going to, and this is kind of a geometric rates. And at some point, they're going to have enough cells to then want to just consume and then go into anaerobic fermentation, or no oxygen present, and then they're going to start just making alcohol. And then eventually they're going to run out of food or get stressed, and I think stress will be a big part of what we're going to talk about today, is that they're eventually just stop. There'll be some reproduction, but not much anymore, of course, and then no more alcohol, and then it stops fermentation.
Right.
And so And so with that, that's the general life cycle of yeast. But then at that point, there's still a ton of yeast left. They're ready to go. They're ready to do something. So they need more beer, and that's where repitching comes in.
Yeah, they need more sugar, right? I mean, because that's basically what they consume. That is their energy source. I remember when I first started brewing, I actually didn't start. I'm one of the weird ones. Even way back in 2003, I don't know who the manufacturer was, but it was liquid yeast that I bought at my homebrew shop. I know. I actually didn't use dry yeast until probably 8 years ago. And everyone was like, that's how you get started. Well, not me. I always used liquid yeast. The realization, the understanding that yeast is a living organism. It is alive. Yeah. It goes in. It consumes wort, the sugars in wort, and you have to, knowing that, I feel, and this might just be a weird Marshall thing, but knowing that helps me to realize how important it is to take care of that yeast, to ensure the best possible environment for them. And so like you said, one of the issues is yeast can get stressed. And I feel like that word is almost a misnomer. But it makes sense, right? You put them in an environment that's a little bit too harsh, or when they don't have enough compatriots to go with them to do the job you want them to do. And they're bound to change. They're bound to do things unlike what you're expecting.
Yeah. Yeah. So stress, and I think I've said this in previous podcasts, analogies like anthropomorphizing yeast only works well. Yes, they're alive, but they're very simple organisms compared to, like, say, Marshall and I, very complicated beings. I think stress is a good example of this. Why is it stressy? Yeast, they want to multiply. They want to eat sugar and multiply and keep. That's their whole life cycle, right? Alcohol is kind of a secondary path for them, right? They kind of convert energy into something. They really want to make new yeast, but we utilize the alcohol production or gas production, say, for baking bread or something like that.
Right.
And that's different. So when you throw yeast that are happy, kind of floating around, not a very alcoholic environment, they respond negatively to high alcohol. They respond negatively to high temperatures. In some cases, not all yeast, of course. They want to be in their zone. And so that's why thinking about stress in the way of, like, when you feel stressed out, yeast have a similar thing that they don't want to be. They want to be in the right place. Every yeast is different too. And actually, I think big thing is, last few years of the Kvike brewing becoming even more, is that some of our conceptions, our preconceptions of what is stressy can be very different, especially for different yeast strains. So that's important. So stress is relative to the strain. Let's remember that.
Absolutely. And I also feel like you mentioned high gravity wort, and then the higher alcohol environment that will produce later on for the yeast, and then also higher temperature, but lower temperatures can stress yeast as well. If yeast are going to do their best to do their job, they want to consume that sugar and get that energy from it. If you toss that yeast in too cool of an environment, that's going to stress them out as well. So like you said, I like thinking of it as a kind of an ideal zone, right, where that yeast is going to operate the best. Now, the only reason we're talking about this right now is because if you are planning on harvesting and reusing the yeast from a batch that you're brewing, you want to make sure that what you're harvesting is still good yeast. And so you want to treat it well. You want to do everything you possibly can, at least if you are harvesting it using certain methods, which we're going to talk about here in a second. You want to do everything you can to ensure that when you take that yeast out and repitch it, that it's going to do mostly what you're expecting it to do. One of the issues that you'll hear talked about quite often, actually, when it comes to reusing yeast, has to do with this concept of genetic drift, or this idea that over time, the yeast that you're pitching or repitching over and over again will eventually start to morph a little bit.
Yeah. So with stress and with generations, yeast, like we said, is alive. It's creating new copies of itself every time. Every copy that's made, it can be a little different, and stress can also affect those things. It could want to produce certain genetic compounds are slightly different, and then you're going to start selecting for certain compounds. I think that's another important thing about reusing yeast. The environment you give it will dictate how it proceeds genetically over time, rather than natural evolution, which is just the survival of the fittest. You're really self-selecting which yeast are going to come next.
Yeah.
And if you always pitch it into 8% double IPA, 8% double IPA, 8% double IPA, there's going to be a change from when you first got that pitch from your yeast vendor. So those kind of things you'd really need to think about, and generationality and how many you can get out of it. It really is strain dependent. It's how you treat it. And I think what we want to set you up for in this show is, if you're going to reuse yeast, if you're really going to go down that path, you want to make sure your beers you're making are setting the yeast up for their best possible pitch down the road.
Right. Exactly. And there are certain harvest and reuse methods, the ones we're going to talk about here in a second, where that is even more important. And I might as well get into it now. I remember I have a recipe out there. It's on brewlosophy.com. If you Google Tiny Bottom Pale Ale, you'll find this recipe. I absolutely love it. And the funny thing about that recipe is it was completely unintentional. I had picked up I forget what yeast it was. It might have been the 090 San Diego super yeast from White Labs. I believe that is what it was. And I'd never used it before. And I thought, you know what? It's super yeast. I want to brew a double IPA, but I don't feel like making a starter. So what I'm going to do is just pitch this single vial into this weird English American version of a pale ale that I just made with stuff that I had lying around. And that ended up being Tiny Bottom Pale Ale. It tasted really good. Well, what I did is I pitched that vial, I let it ferment out. And then when I racked the beer, that really simple beer off of that yeast, I then made double IPA wort and racked it directly onto that yeast cake. And I would say that for a lot of people, this is probably the kind of the first path that they take, or one of the first paths that they take into reusing yeast to try to save money. And again, it's a valid approach. We've actually done plenty of experiments on it that show that it works really well, but it is a very, very simple way to reuse yeast. And again, you want to make sure that the beer that you're fermenting first, that initial fermentation is with a style that isn't too dark. It's not too high in alcohol. It's going to set those yeast up to want to ferment something even bigger and better.
Yeah. The other one I'd bring up in terms of what you want to watch for is IBU content. Because the hot IBUs would have, other than the bittering aspect, they do coat the yeast cell walls a bit, and they can cause some, essentially some flocculation and some other, it could be some fermentation issues down the road. So also just remember keeping that yeast happy is repitching from high IBU. Now there's a good question here, and this is maybe one for Cade. We can ask Cade at a later date. Is what about just high dry hopping rates? Does that affect yeast rehealth? I mean, when it gets mixed up in yeast and hops and stuff, it gets much harder to repitch because it's covered in hop material, right? So that makes it actually even worse. So you want to watch that out as well. It's just you want to only give it a good environment, and you only want yeast at the end of the day, not trub and hop matter.
Well, and that's the thing is if you are racking onto a yeast cake, and I'm talking the very simplest version of reusing yeast. You literally just rack on there. You are everything that's in your trub layer, everything that was in that first beer, there's going to be parts of it that are also going to go to the next beer. And so you'll often hear with this approach in particular, start low and pale and work your way up on the AB. If you're going to do that, right? Work your way up on ABV and IBU and color so that by the time you get to that fourth or that fifth iteration of that yeast, it's prepped and ready to go. And maybe you're not going to use it anymore. So you do make that Russian Imperial Stout or that double IPA. Sure. If you talk to commercial brewers, I don't hear this term as often anymore, but they used to commonly talk about, cone to cone. And that's basically the same thing on a commercial scale is pulling off a good chunk of yeast from a smaller ABV beer or a paler beer and repitching that in a subsequent batch. And it's a process that gets used all the time by commercial brewers because again, yeast isn't cheap. On the commercial scale, I was talking with Brad from Crow and Wolf just yesterday. And he was saying, he's like, man, yeast is easily the most expensive part of our batch, pound for pound, right? I mean, for the amount that you're actually getting and using. And so to be able to reuse it on the commercial scale, you can save you quite a bit of coin.
Yeah. And the cone to cone thing, I think, has changed over time for many brewers because, well, as the industry has grown, cone to cone is like, well, I don't have another place to store my yeast, so I'm just going to go schedule these batches and go back and forth. Now they've gotten a little wiser. There's something called the yeast brink, which is basically a storage container for your yeast in between batches, and then you wheel the yeast brink out, load it up full of yeast, take it outside, or put it back in the fridge or whatever, and then maybe warm it back up before you pitch it again, and then that kind of. You get a feel for it too, right? I would say, Crow and Wolf or any commercial brewery, they're going to get a feel for right, how much yeast do I really need to move? What volume of yeast do I need to put in for this next batch? Because you're fermenting, and when you get it pure from the shop, I mean that's the reason they're doing it is they're giving you a pure, very little trub, very little anything else, right? Just yeast. And then as you ferment, you're going to have more stuff at the bottom. And there's another one there is, maybe taking some yeast off halfway through the fermentation or 75% of the way through. So you're getting less of the other matter. But, are there other tips and tricks?
Yeah, and that is taking yeast off mid fermentation. That's called top cropping, or you can go in and take some of that krausen off. And there's I believe that's common in like British breweries. That's another way to harvest and reuse yeast. For a lot of brewers who are using carboys, that's a very difficult task.
Yeah, it's pretty tough. Yeah,
I actually don't know any home brewers who use that method to reuse yeast, so we won't spend too much time on it. But it is a valid approach that gets used in certain commercial breweries that I'm aware of. That works really well. And again, when you're taking the krausen off, when you're taking that yeast from the top off, you're actually getting really clean, surprisingly clean, pure yeast that's sitting above that fermenting beer. So again, I've never done it, so I can't speak to my experience on it, but I do want to touch on that one. A couple of other things when you're pitching onto a yeast cake that you just want to keep in mind is that again, like you mentioned, or we were talking about earlier, whatever you fermented before could potentially impact the beer that you're making. So we already talked about kind of stepping it up in ABV and all that. If you happen to make, say, like a session IPA, I've done this before. It's the reason I'm speaking to it. You can get away with making like another session IPA and not really worrying about the contribution of hot matter, dry hop matter that's in your yeast cake, your trub. I wouldn't recommend making like an IPA and then making a blonde ale. You're going to get flavor carry. I mean, maybe it won't be huge, but it makes complete sense that you would get at least some flavor carryover. So if you're going to pitch onto your yeast cake, plan your brewing schedule, ahead of time, because you want to make sure that what you're brewing isn't going to be impacted by the beer you previously fermented.
I would say one more pro and one more maybe con, but just something to watch out for. One pro is, if you're good on sanitization, right? Theoretically speaking, you could just keep pitching into that vessel, emptying and repitching it because it's a sanitized vessel. So there's one benefit there.
Yeah.
The other one, and I just make it maybe something to observe or watch out for, is we may talk about this in a little bit, but there's under pitching. I think people are aware of not adding enough yeast for the beer. There's pitch rate calculators, but you guys also watch over pitching. There will be some negative. The negative of under pitching is the beer doesn't ferment, of course,
right?
Or ferments very slowly. The over pitching, I've heard of meaty character or are there just odd yeast characters coming out. So you just want to be a little cognizant of that, of course, and then your experience will dictate that too. So I just bring that up.
I feel like it's really difficult to over pitch. I mean that's kind of been one of those things people have been talking about a bit lately, is how very difficult it is to seriously get a detrimental impact from over pitching. It can be wasteful if you're buying too much yeast, but I have not had the experience or a negative experience when I'm racking onto a yeast cake. One of the things you've got to keep in mind is that if there is any contamination at all, even if you don't taste it in the first beer that you make, it's only going to take off even more and continue to grow. That bacteria is also going to reproduce, that wild yeast, when you rack fresh wort onto that yeast. So you're going to know very, very quickly. So there is some risk involved in reusing yeast, particularly using this method. Now, if you are one of those people who cannot tolerate the idea, and I can relate with you, I promise, of racking wort onto all willy-nilly onto a previously used yeast cake, there are other ways around that you can kind of use a method like this that are kind of offshoots, is the way I think of it. One way that I've found is really, really beneficial is to pour off a small amount of the slurry. So you're not racking onto the entire yeast cake. But when you pour that off, you'll see it start to separate. And there's a creamy white layer that always settles out together. It's very weird to me how it does that, but it stratifies, and that creamy white layer is the yeast that you want. If you have a 1 liter mason jar or a Nalgene bottle or something like that, and you take your carboy and you swirl it all, you have a little bit of beer left in there, you swirl it all up, and you pour off about 1 liter of that yeasty trub, you will notice that stratification happening, and then you can pour off the stuff on top. You're going to see that you get a lot of little hop bits, a lot of that kind of proteinaceous brown stuff. I don't think that hurts beer. The other nice thing is you are eliminating the risk of over pitching by doing that, and you still have ample yeast cells. I mean, technically probably still an over pitch, but it works really well.
Yeah. The nice thing is, I like this. This is my preferred method because it's kind of a good middle ground. There's other methods we'll talk to about how to just save yeast over time, but this one of I like also getting a vertical vessel, a Nalgene bottle, great example.
Yeah.
Right. Because then you can see exactly, okay, here's the top, here's the creamy layer, and then here's the bottom, right? And then I know because it's clear, a nice clear one, I can clean it every time. You can even get ones you could probably boil too if you really wanted some lab stuff, right? And then you'll never have a risk of contamination, or you'll have much less risk of contamination, and you'll get verified clean yeast. And I think this is the best way because, again, managing your yeast health, this is a consistent way of doing that.
Yeah. So I recently started using Delta firm tanks, and one of the things that I like about them now the Delta folks will slay me if they hear me calling it a yeast dump, because it's not. It has a clean out port on the bottom that some of us crazy people kind of use as a yeast dump. Dude, talk about ease of harvesting yeast from a clean batch of beer. I did it. I didn't harvest it for reuse, but I was just messing around because on the first time I used the Delta firm tank, and I'm telling you, I got a little like a 1-inch elbow, stainless steel elbow that I attached to the valve on the bottom. You open up that valve, it takes you kind of hear it like, oh, here it comes, and then it just comes gushing out. And you've got this nice clean yeast. You got your trube with it. You can take that. And then you can do, if you want, you can do what a lot of people were doing. It was the method that I used for probably 2 years. It takes a little bit of work, but it's called rinsing yeast. You hear a lot of people call it washing yeast. That is an actual scientific thing that happens with acid washing and all that. All we're doing on the homebrew scale is rinsing yeast, taking it, removing as much of the trube as possible so that what you're left with is that creamy, healthy, viable yeast layer. And there are various ways that I've seen people go about doing it. The way that I did it was, again, somewhat complicated. It was kind of a thing that I would set up like early on a Saturday morning before my family woke up. And basically what it involves is you take yeast from a batch like we were talking about earlier, and rather than reusing it right away or putting that, truby yeast into your fridge for reuse, you take it and you mix it with really clean, distilled, sterile water. I often would just boil water and then cool it down in the fridge so I knew it was sterile. And then you shake up, I'm not going to go through the entire process. You can find this online, but you shake up the yeast, a certain amount of yeast with this clean water. You let it settle out. You decant what's on top. That's all your trube stuff. You'll see, again, hot bits and all that. And you do that a couple of times until you just have this pure, smallish kind of slug of yeast, but it is very, very viable. I mean, you've got a ton of cells in there. And then you can take that, and typically what I would do with that is I would use that yeast to prop up another starter. So I wasn't pitching that directly like I have when I just harvest directly from a batch. I would use that nice clean yeast that I rinsed to again prop up another starter and then pitch that.
Yeah. I mean, again, makes perfect sense. Again, making these beers, I think, Marshall, you tend to be one that brews more moderate alcohol, moderate hop strengths. You're giving it great media to propagate in, and so it makes sense. And I have those Delta firm tanks too, so I'll take some notes and maybe I'll throw that elbow on one of my units.
Yeah, they're awesome. They're on. I got it on Amazon. There's I think I got 2 for like $18. Wow, so pretty good deal. Yeah, I'll send you the link, Andy.
Thank you.
But so that's one way. The rinsing yeast thing, you'll see it's very popular. And when I first was introduced to the idea of harvesting and reusing yeast, it was in this order. It was racking onto a yeast cake, and then it was, well, you don't want to do that because it's too dirty. Rinse your yeast. Now, I've got a little bit of a horror story about the rinsing yeast thing. I thought in my head, well, if I'm rinsing it, it doesn't matter what kind of beer I first fermented. And I took I think I made, again, a double IPA or something like that. This was back in the days where everyone was trying to make a Pliny,
Sure.
I'm sure some people are still doing that, but I made a double IPA. I took that, and it was a big one, probably more close to a triple IPA, if that's a thing. And I rinsed that yeast and I pitched it in a really simple, just pale blonde ale that I wanted to have around for my neighbors. It did not taste right. I'm telling you.
Interesting.
It was, but the thing is, it wasn't hoppy. And I can't say that this would happen every time or it would happen to you, but it happened to me where it had this flavor that I can only describe as rubbery. And it was this very odd, it wasn't a contamination, but it was this very odd yeasty kind of like, it was gross. I wouldn't recommend doing it. And to me, that was what I'm presuming that was stressed yeast doing the job that fresher yeast would have done better.
So I think I have another story. It's, as you go progress through any hobby, you have a problem. Maybe you push past it and then learn more and keep going in the hobby. And early on, I had these issues where I would just be using US-05 or 1056 or some variant of Chico, right? And I would have a good few batches, then maybe reuse your yeast, and then have a weird batch. I'm like, oh, this doesn't taste right. And I think I'm on your page there. I think there are sometimes some mutations or some selective pressure put on the Chico variant where a little bit of a phenolic-y character comes out. I'm right there with you. So I think there is something to that. I think there is a stress-related component to American ale yeast, even though they're not PUF positive or phenolic positive.
Yeah.
They can get there. So I'm right there with you. Again, stressed yeast is not healthy yeast.
Yeah, and it will do weird things to your beer. You mentioned the Chico strain. A lot of people have this assumption that, WLP 001 is US-05, is Y Yeast 1056, is A07 flagship. That's not necessarily the case. Each one of those labs has, a microbiologist who's taking an isolate from wherever they're getting their yeast, and that's not an illegal thing to do, is to borrow somebody else's yeast. But they're taking an isolate, they're purifying it, and then they're propping it up from that isolate. And so it makes sense that as similar as those strains might be, that they're different. And the reason I bring that up is because we were talking a little bit about genetic drift earlier. Well, that's kind of a good example of that. That we've done comparisons of, I've done it a few times even without writing it up on the website, where you've fermented beer with US-05 and with flagship next to each other, and they're the same exact wort, different yeasts, and they taste different.
Yes.
It's not that one's better or worse. Well, I went through this whole phase. I had a bunch of US-05 at one point. I bought a box of the stuff. Mm-hmm. Every beer I made with that came out with this peppery weirdness to it. Yeah. And so, I don't know if it had anything to do with that particular lot of yeast, if it had something to do with the way I was brewing with it. But yeah, they are different. And I think that, if you're going to reuse a yeast, pick one that you really want to reuse.
Yeah. Pick a strain that has been good for you, the beer that you've been making, you've liked into. And I think, before we jump into the next part of this, which is other ways of reusing yeast, or other ways of harvesting yeast, I think one thing I want to bring up just very briefly is on sour and wild mixed fermentation beer. In that is very common to reuse yeast there and reuse pitches. You tend to use a much less volume of yeast or bacteria or Brettanomyces. But I will say that is actually the single best way, in my opinion, to make consistent sour, wild, funky beer at home is actually reusing stuff that's worked in the past.
Absolutely.
Early on in that production of that, when I was making this, 8-9 years ago, there was almost no producers, commercial producers specifically, making pitches that of wild or sour stuff. There was like maybe the lambic blend from white, like Y Yeast, or something like other Flanders from the White Labs. And so you have to collect things from bottles, collect things from other people. But then what I found was, as I built a house culture, again, we talked about house flavor, but specifically in wild and mixed fermentation, house culture is huge. And as you reuse that stuff and you make beer consistently using the stuff you like, and then dumping the batches you don't, your wild, sour, funky beers will just be that much better. So just I think the thing to keep in mind.
So one of the things just on that point that I've heard, I don't make that much wild and sour beer, not nearly as much as you do, Andy. But one of the things that I've heard is that, and it makes sense to me, is that over time, if you are reusing yeast that you use to make, say, a Flemish red, right? Mm-hmm. You are going to get the souring power, or the ability for that blended, microbial blend to sour the beer is going to be a lot faster, right?
Yeah.
Because you've just got more of that bacteria to do the work. And so one of the things that I've heard people do if they're harvesting and reusing those microbial blends is adding more Saccharomyces to the blend, because you don't want the bacteria or the wild yeast to overpower the sac that you have in there. I don't know if that's true. It's just something I've heard.
I think you're right, and definitely in the right mental path of that is that bacteria can actually multiply much faster than yeast. They're smaller, they eat faster, they're just going to crank faster, and so this is common, and this is over the I'd say decade and a half of mixed fermentation in the United States. We've gone from super sour, very acidic, and it's like okay, we're going to power back on the acidity, and one way is to pitch less bacteria, but the other way is to control with IBUs, to actually up the IBUs, and you're seeing the IBUs kind of increase in these beers so that they're not as sour or they blend. In my home experience, nowadays there's like, at least 2 or 3 off the top of my head of really high quality pitches you can buy, just direct pitches of wild yeast bootleg, biology being one of them that just comes off the top of my head. But those are controlled and then blended. At home, what I was finding was with the initial beers, okay, the first beer was good, but it wasn't super sour, it wasn't super funky, it wasn't super complicated. But that second, third, fourth beer, not only did it get sour and funkier and fruitier and just better, faster, it was much more consistent.
Yeah.
And so that's why I bring it up, is that don't be, oh shucks, it didn't work the first time. I waited a year for this beer and it's still not doing what I want. I guarantee you the next one will come out in 6 months, and then 3 months, and then 2 months, and then you'll just have a batch of all these beers, and they'll just be better, and you'll like them a lot more over time. So there's kind of a game you have to play, but I think it's a game worth playing.
Yeah, when it comes to the sour and funky stuff, I actually think that harvesting is. I would say that I highly recommend doing that, because then,
exactly.
in addition to decreasing the amount of time you need to turn those beers around, you're kind of creating your own little house, blend. And it's always going to be different. The way that, all the different microbes reproduce and grow. And so the just the amounts that you have in your own little blend, I think that's kind of fun. So, well, my experience using harvested yeast with the methods we've discussed so far have been generally positive, but there were aspects of each I wasn't a huge fan of, which led me to adopting a different approach. We're going to be getting into that right after these messages. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the exGEERitor, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to exGEERitor.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. Way back in 2012, I was brewing a ton and had started rinsing yeast for reuse. Initially, I was just excited about extending the life of a single pitch of yeast, but after going through the process umpteen times, it got really old really quick. We'll put it that way. I remember hitting the web in search of a more efficient way to harvest yeast, but came up with nothing. Then, while making a starter in a 5-liter Erlenmeyer flask, something occurred to me. Why not overbuild the starter and reserve whatever wasn't getting pitched for a future batch? And that was, for me at least, the genesis of the method that we refer to as harvesting yeast from starters. And it is it's a method that I've since learned a lot of people have begun using. It is a very clean method. To contrast it with the methods that we talked about earlier, you are literally just making a starter. You are building the most ideal environment for yeast replication by doing a 1040 wort and having no hops in there. It's super clean. Any trub is just from the protein that was in the dry malt extract. It is an incredibly clean method. And if you trust yeast starter calculators, you can very easily predict with some accuracy how much yeast you're actually harvesting. So when you harvest it, the way I would do it is I would harvest it, and then I would prop up another starter later on down the line, because I would use whatever was left over in the Erlenmeyer flask to pitch into the beer that I was making. And so I referred to this method as iterative harvesting. And what I mean is, I would determine the size of the starter needed to achieve a proper pitch rate for the beer that I was making, and then adjust on the calculator such that I would propagate about 200 billion additional cells, because that's kind of the ideal pitch, what I like to have. And then about 200 billion additional cells would go into a 1 liter, Erlen, or a 1 liter mason jar. And then I'd pop that in my fridge and I'd have it for later. Absolutely beautiful method that I've used it hundreds of times.
So you're making the imperial yeast version of Marshall's starters.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing is that idea just came to me because I had these huge 5 liter Erlenmeyer flasks, and I was like,
by the way, but kudos to you for wanting to wield a 5 liter Erlenmeyer flask. I have no desire to clean one of those. So
well, you know why I got it. I thought everybody who brewed lager beers had a 5 liter Erlenmeyer flask.
Yeah. I go 3. I'm at 3 liter. I'm stopping there. It's okay. Yeah.
Your wussy little 3 liter.
Exactly, my 3 liter starter. Yeah.
But yeah, I had these huge flasks, and I'm sitting there going, I was using them for everything. So if I'm making a pale ale and I only needed 500 milliliters of starter wort, I had all of this, space left. I thought, why don't I just make a bigger starter and take some of that yeast off? And it just happened to work beautifully. To kind of run down the method real quickly, once you get that starter going, you want to wait for it to be completely done fermenting. You're going to pour off again about a liter of the homogenized slurry. I always use a stir plate, so it's always homogenized. So I take it right off the stir plate, put a magnet on it so you don't pour your stir bar into your harvested yeast.
Careful.
Yep. I've done it before many times, actually. You're going to pour that off, and then you want to cap the mason jar, but you want to keep the cap relatively loose, only to let the beer at this point kind of off gas, should it not be completely done fermenting. I've never had one of these explode on me. I've never had one, act weird, but it's just a safety measure. And then that stored yeast can be used to repropagate, again, over and over again. I took a pitch of yeast from a single pack. I took it out 16 generations. 16 generations using this. And so again, iterative harvesting is what I refer to this method as. I started with one. I made a big yeast starter that had just enough extra for me to harvest. I harvested that, took it again, made another starter, harvested another bit, and went over and over 16 times. And I'm telling you, that I believe, again, I think it was 090, the San Diego super yeast, that 16th generation yeast was perfect. I had no issues with it. There was no noticeable detriment to the beer. The only reason I didn't take it out any further is I gave it to a friend of mine who was in need of some yeast, and he didn't harvest from it. So
yeah, it's like very similar, sourdough propagation in bread making. But what I really like about this method is its consistency. You're always doing it the same way, right? You're always presenting the yeast with the same environment. I want to propagate you at this temperature with a stir plate with this volume, and imagine using about 1040 for the starter wort, so very consistent.
Yeah.
And then it's going to go right back in and be held. And so you're just kind of peeling off pieces of it every time. And, I would say, if anything, this method is the most like how a lab would propagate its yeast, right? It's presenting the yeast with the same medium every time. I would say more or less ideal growth conditions. So growing a bunch of yeast, not a lot of alcohol, no hops, so, and I think there's a reason why it took off for you, Marshall, why this method took off. It's simple and it's consistent.
It's simple. It's consistent. It doesn't require rinsing. There's no concern about a contaminated. I mean, anytime you pitch yeast, I suppose there's a little bit of risk that something else is going to get in there and screw it up. But this is about the cleanest method that I can think of for harvesting yeast. And it has, I'm telling you, I've heard from thousands of people since I published this article on harvesting yeast from starters who have said, why didn't I think of that? This works so well. And again, you've got one. There was a point in time where I had like 7 different yeast strains, each in their own little jar. And I knew that jar I could take and I could repropagate and pull off another fresh pitch of it. There were times where I would make up a yeast starter just to keep the yeast fresh, because it's so easy. And DME isn't that expensive. I think it's like $12 at More Beer for a 3-pound bag of Pilsner DME. You take a little bit of that stuff, you mix it with water, you boil it for a minute, and I boil right in the flask. I know some people are afraid to do that. You boil it right in the flask, chill it off in your utility sink, and then pitch your yeast and let it go for a couple days. Pull off a liter of it, and then pitch that into your wort, and you're good to go. And you can do that over and over and over again. Now, we were talking about, wild yeast and bacteria. I've not done it with that. I have heard of people who do, and they have the same experience we were talking about. They actually do end up kind of producing this house blend that ends up, souring stuff faster and working really well for them. No experience there, but it seems to me like it would work out really well.
Yeah, no, this is great. And one thing, you can just save it. And there's a lot of, when you're talking with monocultures where you're just thinking with a yeast strain, there's one thing, right? Because I can give it the ideal conditions, or at least you could develop a ideal condition state. Now with mixed culture stuff, we're talking about, at least 3 or 4, if not 10, 12, 15 different things going on. So it's different, of course, but I think it's at least the right direction, right step forward. The next thing is obviously having many different containers, many different, when you look at, say, a Lambic or, a Goose Blendery or even the United States variants of that, they have tons of barrels, right? So they don't need, if a few barrels go bad, it's okay, right? The propagation, the entire line is moving forward, even if there's a few people that get left behind, right?
Yeah.
Unlike in a one single, 60 barrel conical, this thing needs to work.
Yeah.
I cannot fail. So that's why, yeast is so important at the big brew house. And, imagine Marshall, oh, okay, I have your few mason jars. Well, a commercial brewery doesn't have just a few hundred mason jars sitting around of their yeast, right? They need to have the ability to, have 1 or 2. And that's why you tend to see only 1 or 2 yeasts at many breweries, because they're reusing yeast.
Yeah.
They're not going out and buying a new pack every time and then having 18 different yeast strains. It just become not economical. So,
well, that's one of the beauties of homebrewing, is that we can do that, and
exactly.
It isn't too uneconomical for us. But some of the questions that I've gotten over the years about harvesting yeast in this way, one of the most common ones is obviously how long can you do this? How far can you take it out? I've had my experience with the 16 generations on that particular strain. I've taken a number of other strains out 8 to 10 generations and not had any issues. That would be A09 Pub was one of those. So that's the fuller strain. I've done Chico. I've actually done a few different Chico strains. A07 Flagship was the latest one, and it worked fine every time for, I think it was 7 generations. It worked out great. Another question that I've gotten is can you do this with dry yeast? I don't know where the idea came from that you can't make a starter with dry yeast, or that it works perfectly fine. You can absolutely do it with dry yeast. I've actually done it with I think it was Belle Saison, and I had it go out like 4 generations, and it worked perfectly fine. In fact, the beer that I pitched with the starter, the leftover starter, from the Belle Saison, started fermenting much faster than when you just sprinkle on dry yeast. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. If there's a particular dry yeast out there that you love and you want to have around, it won't be dry anymore, but do it. Harvest some. Make up a starter, harvest it, and reuse it generation over generation.
I think that the rehydration, and I think it's because every packet of dry yeast has different rules for how to restart it, right?
Yeah.
And some say don't put this into beer. It will, and then there is science, there's knowledge out there that suggests a lot of yeast cells die, but you still have a ton of yeast cells left after that propagation. So I think of course your mileage may vary. We have one data point here with Marshall, and I will back up that data point that some Chico yeast can have some issues repropagating from dry yeast. But, nowadays there's also so many new variants. There's so many more dry yeast companies out there, play around there. I think there's almost, I'm probably wrong about this. I think there's almost as many dry yeast variants as there is liquid yeast variants you can get out there. There's so many new ones.
There's a lot.
Give it a shot.
Yeah, I think one of the issues as well with making starters for dry yeast in general is that the argument is the dry yeast is so cheap that you're better off just buying 2 pouches of it and pitching that than you are wasting money on the DME. Well, that's not the case here. You are actually propagating from 1 pouch of yeast, 1 sachet of dry yeast. And so that you can harvest and reuse that yeast. Ultimately, that is going to be a lot less expensive for you in the long run if you're taking it out 4 or 5 generations. So just some things to consider when it comes to that type of thing. Another question that I've gotten is, how long can I store that yeast before I need to reuse it, right? Before I need to use it again. I've done a couple of experiments with this one right after I wrote up the article on harvesting yeast from starters. I've used yeast that was about 5-6 months old from date of harvest. That's that's always the date that I used. That's 5 to 6 months old, and it props up just fine. I wouldn't pitch it directly. I used some Kolsch yeast one time. I talked about this on a recent episode that I had harvested from a starter like that, and I threw it in the fridge. It was about 5 months old. I made up a batch of wort, just pitched that Kolsch yeast direct, and it was abysmal. It was really, really gross. So just make sure that, again, probably best to kind of stick with a 3-month max type of thing. And all you have to do is take that yeast out, prop up another starter. You can make a really small one even, prop up the starter, and then you can just harvest that whole starter and store it for another 2 to 3 months and reuse that. So another way, kind of another version of harvesting yeast from starters that I know some people do. In fact, I think Olin Sudduth from Brew United uses this method, is to make a large starter, just like you would with the previous method that we discussed, from a single pack of yeast. And then rather than harvesting just one pitch off of that and then pitching the rest of the starter, you split it between multiple mason jars. And what this will allow you to do, one, is to have a very consistent and even pitch rate, right? So each of those jars ostensibly will have about the same amount of cells in them. So if you trust the calculator that you're using, and I think you should for the most part, you can determine almost exactly what your pitch rate is going to be per mason jar that you're doing. So let's say you make a 5-liter starter or a 4-liter starter, and you're harvesting 1 liter, 4 1-liter jars. You've got these 4 1-liter jars that are going to have about the same number of cells in them, and that can be really convenient for people who are brewing quite a bit, because now all you have to do is take one of those jars, prop it up in a smaller starter. And one way that I know people were doing it is decanting the supernatant off the top of the harvested yeast, and then just adding a small amount of freshly made DME wort to the mason jar, putting the lid on real loosely and letting it re-ferment out. And then there goes your viability. Now you're back up to where you kind of want to be when it comes to pitching. Yeah,
it makes perfect sense. I mean, it's like you're, rather than making a batch of beer, you're just making a bunch of starters, right? So then this is actually probably great for people that have limited time when they want to just buy 1 pack of yeast or 2 packs of yeast, because they brew often enough, but they don't want to do the shipping or go and get I think a big thing, and we didn't bring it up yet, but I'll bring it up now, is, if there's a one-off yeast strain that maybe it's a platinum strain, some companies call them platinum strains, or, library strains, where it's like, oh man, I really love this Australian sparkling ale yeast, but only comes out once a year.
Exactly.
I want to keep it for a long time, and I'm going to make a bunch of them and then cycle through all these starters and then have that always around. So I think this is great, especially, again, if you don't have the time, but you want to just buckle down, and a 5-liter starter is basically a 1 gallon, a 1 gallon batch of beer, right? So
right.
I'm just having a very small pitch of beer, and then having all these jars ready to go, because then maybe it's like, okay, I have a lot of free time now. Again, my time was limited. I did a bunch of starters, and now I have a bunch of free time. So let me make like 3 5-gallon batches of beer like this weekend, and now I have 3 starters ready to go. I don't have to worry about yeast, right? The less you need to concern yourself with ordering ingredients and planning around stuff, you can be a little bit more spontaneous with your brew day.
Exactly. And one of the things that I think is neat with this method is, let's say you make those 4 jars and you're going to reserve 1 for another propagation session. So you've got 1 that you're going to use to make another 4 jars later on down the line. So you've got 3 nice pitches of yeast. Each one has about 200 billion cells, give or take. We'll say, well, you're not required to repropagate that in a starter. If it's relatively fresh, you made it last weekend and you're brewing a week later, you can pull that stuff out. I recommend letting it warm up a little bit, pour off that supernatant, and then just pitch it right into your wort. That is really, it's only a week old. You're going to have really high viability. And that's one way to, again, knock out, because making yeast starters is not that fun. I mean, it's kind of a boring part of the brewing process, I think. So to be able to just grab a jar out of your fridge, let it warm up, and pitch it right into some wort, again, you're going to want to be mindful of the OG of the beer that you're making. But let's say you want to make a double IPA. Well, now you've got 3 pitches of yeast. You could take all 3 of those and pitch them in, right? Pour off the supernatant, pitch them in there. You already got it made. I know that the yeast labs are going to hate hearing me say this, but it's also a really good way to, take 1 pouch of yeast and split it between you and some friends if you're all brewing with the same yeast.
Sure. I mean, I think, one thing, and, to give the credit to the yeast companies, we're, at Brewlosophy, for our experiments, we frequently take the 200 billion cell pack and go right into a fermenter, and that's it. Right. And I think that's why we're recommending that, is that we have a lot of data, every week we have data showing that this is actually a really nice way of doing it. And when you're pitching around that 200 billion cells, it works for OGs in those levels. I know there's lookup tables that say 1 million cells per milliliter per degree Plato. I read all the textbooks, but, we are getting successful beers, from 1040 to 1060, 1060-ish, right?
Yeah.
With these beers that are really good. Technically that's an overpitch. What are you doing, Andy? Well, no, like we said, it's okay and it's consistent. and it makes great beer. Let's be clear. So in the end, if it's making great beer, then stick with it. And that's why I like that kind of the number we're throwing around, the 200 billion cells, the liter starters, that the or liter containers, not necessarily starters, and it works, right?
It works.
So.
And the 200 billion cell thing, the only reason I say that is because there's two reasons, actually. One is when I was doing all of my calculations using the Brew United yeast starter calculator, that's kind of where it was. When I was making these starters based on, again, you got to put the date of the yeast that you're starting with and all of that. But generally, if it was fresh yeast, each 1 liter had about 200 billion cells. I think it was like 191 billion, at least, again, for me. And maybe my calculator was weird. But the proof was in the pudding. It was working really well for me. And I have used this batch, we call it, I refer to this one as batch propagation because you're splitting one batch into multiple jars. I've used this a couple of times, and I'm telling you, being able to go to your fridge and pull out a jar of yeast and just pitch it is so convenient if you are concerned with saving money on yeast. I mean, it's a really good way to do it. The thing is, again, it's all the same stuff that you have to be aware of is if that jar is not sanitized, you could potentially contaminate that yeast, which would ruin the entire process, right? That your whole goal is to get yeast that you can reuse over and over. So make sure to mind your sanitation, your cleaning. I know a lot of people, and this is a tip. I actually went out and bought a pressure cooker just for this to sterilize these jars. You go get a pressure cooker and you put a couple of jars in there and you just let them go for 20 minutes. It's kind of scary. I was using an old school with a knocker on the top, but then you've got an absolutely sterile jar that you're adding this yeast into, which again, just further reduces the risk that something is going to go awry. Harvesting yeast is awesome. If you're cheap like me, it's even more awesome. And you can really get away with stretching yeast out a long way. They're just, again, those considerations. There's a possibility of genetic drift. There's always that possibility of contamination. The storage time thing, you don't want to let it sit in there for years and years. And one kind of like rule of thumb that I believe John Palmer told me was when you start to notice that creamy white yeast is starting to take on more of a peanut buttery look and darken up a little bit, that is autolysis. That is yeast cell death, or at least that's what I've been told. And so just you might want to toss it or prop it up in a starter before harvesting another fresh pitch.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think again, I bring up the cost aspect is great because then it's you're saving a couple bucks. You can put that money towards a very expensive hop you want to buy or something like that, or a really nice craft malt. But the other side of this is creating that house culture. Say your local homebrew is really popular. You have a really great amber ale, but you're going to create something that really lasts around the homebrew community. This is one way to do it. And then the convenience, right? From one pouch, we're saying you can make 3 or 4 different beers. I mean, you can't get much better than that, in my opinion, for your stretching your buck. So.
Absolutely. To me, it's harvesting yeast. If you are a cost conscious brewer, harvest your own yeast, buy ingredients in bulk, and you will do well for yourself in terms of the money side of things. Well, Andy, that's all I've got on harvesting and reusing yeast. Any final thoughts from you?
Not really. I think this is just a great method to explore and do, and especially if you're maybe getting a little sick and tired of just buying yeast every time. You want to play this. You want to do a new activity, a new hobby. Maybe you're coming to the hobby now. You've never done starters or something like that. Check this out. This is fun. And this is something where you'd be like, hey, I really like this strain of yeast. I want to keep it around the house for a while. And, like we've said, 10 plus times with just simple things, simple sanitization techniques, just being consistent, and you're good to go.
Absolutely. Well, don't forget to check out our new podcast, The Brew Lab, where host Kate Job takes you into the lab with real brewing scientists to discuss fascinating research they've done on our favorite beverage. And remember, head over to brewlosophy.com to stay current on everything we're up to. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no.